Okay, good morning and welcome to the 21st meeting in 2013 of the Finance Committee of the Scottish Parliament. Could I please remind everyone present to please turn off any mobile phones, tablets or other electronic devices. Our only business today is to take evidence as part of our scrutiny of the Public Bodies Joint Working Scotland Bill's Financial Memorandum. The bill is designed to establish a framework to support the integration of local authority and health board functions. We will hear firstly from two witnesses who submitted written evidence to the committee before putting questions to the Scottish Government Bill team. If either participant would like to respond to a question or make a point, please indicate to me or the clerk. And certainly from my point of view, I will focus questions originally at one of our witnesses, but the other can make a point subsequent to that. So I'd like to welcome to the meeting Jean Campbell from East Dunbartonshire Council and Nick Kenton of NHS Highland. Now, we don't have any opening statements this morning, so we're going to go straight to questions, and as usual I will ask some opening questions and then I'll widen out the questioning to members of the committee. So first of all, in terms of East Dunbartonshire Council, I'd like to ask Jean Campbell if she can basically enlighten us with regard to some of the answers that have been given in her submission. So I'd like to take you to paragraph 5 of your submission, and what you've said here in response to the question about financial implications for your organisation is that, and I quote, "There is no focus on the issues arising from the delegation of budgets and resources under each of the two options available, which is a key area of concern." I'm just wondering if you can perhaps expand just a wee bit more for the record on those concerns.
Okay. I think in reading through the financial memorandum, the focus was quite clearly on the transition and the implementation costs that might arise from the bill. But obviously from our perspective, we do have concerns about what would go into the pot in terms of the totality of an integrated budget, and that would include aspects of the acute spend and how far the guidance will go in terms of being prescriptive around the level of funding that needs to go into the integrated pot. And obviously the whole premise behind integration in the bill are around effecting a shift in resources from emergency admissions into community-based alternatives. And then obviously to be able to do that, you need to have sufficient budget within the control of the single accountable officer to be able to effect that kind of change, and some of the risks that might come if that's not in the pot, if you like. And I think the focus, certainly the financial memorandum, didn't really go into or delve into some of the risks that might be around in relation to trying to deliver on that agenda.
Okay, I mean, one of the things you've said is, in the following paragraph, is that a significant omission appears to be an estimate of the cost of the rising demographics of older people requiring a service, given there are savings predicated on the way this will be delivered into the future. Again, I wonder if you can comment further on that and talk a wee bit more about the risks that you've already touched on.
The financial memorandum doesn't go into any great detail on the estimations around the costs that will come from the rising demographic growth. There have been other studies done around this that say that by 2031 we'll be looking at an increase in the budget of 2.5 billion, and some of the efficiency measures that are highlighted within the financial memorandum obviously go some way, but not a lot of the way, to try and address a lot of that pressure. Sorry, I've lost my track. Obviously, a lot of the efficiencies that are built into the financial memorandum are about assumptions that things will be delivered in terms of delayed discharge, in terms of the effectiveness of anticipatory care planning. And I suppose there's some risks around how successful or not that will be in delivering the efficiencies that are outlined within the bill, and the extent that will deliver on the demographic pressure that we know is out there, but which is not maybe as evident in the financial memorandum itself, but certainly work has been done elsewhere around this particular issue.
Okay, I'm just wondering, Mr. Kenton, if you can kind of comment on any of what we've heard so far.
Yes, I think I think it's true to say that the bill doesn't delve into the impact of demographic changes. However, what I would say is those changes are happening irrespective of the bill or integration or whatever. So in a sense, I don't think those costs are directly relevant to the bill itself. And I would suggest that going down the route of integration is a way of trying to mitigate the impact of demographic change rather than building it into the cost of the bill. And I agree with Jean that the sort of offsets quoted in the financial memorandum are fairly high level, and they also rely on releasing sort of fixed costs from the acute sector. So there is risk around that. But I think these are high-level costs which just try to give an overview of the bill. But I think the key thing is the demographic changes will happen irrespective of if the bill happens or not. So we need to address those rather than get hung up on those as part of the bill scrutiny, I would think.
I mean, in your responses, you've said, for example, that in terms of financial implications, you're saying it's reasonable to assume they'll be in line with the estimates made in the financial memorandum and the assumptions seem reasonable. But I noticed an interesting paragraph you said when this is an issue which I think the committee is wrestled with, and indeed has the Scottish Government. You say in paragraph 9 of the consultation responses that it is worth noting that the integration of budgets between partner bodies requires a high degree of trust and openness, and this is as much about leadership and culture as legislation. I think we would all agree with that. I'm just wondering, how confident are you of this, that will actually be delivered? I know Highland has some experience in terms of this.
Well, I think, yes, in terms of the financial implications, those are at two levels. The first level is the actual cost of making the transition, and I think there's been a reasonable attempt in the bill to quantify that, and those are, I think, are quantifiable, but I think they pale into significance in terms of when compared with the wider implications of really sharing budgets for real. And I think my view is it's hard to legislate for that. That does have to be done with a degree of openness and transparency, which is hard to set down in legislation. So when we went down the route we took, we had to place trust in our counterparts at Highland Council. And during our first transitional year, I mean, I think it's fair to say it's not a secret. We had some very challenging negotiations between ourselves around the money, but we sort of came through that. And I think we were always open and above board. And I think our sort of move to integration began in December 2010, and there's probably a dozen really key people in key parts of the organisation who drove that forward and were keen to make it happen with that sort of degree of openness and trust. So although we've got our partnership agreement is 400 pages long, that might sound like a large document, but it doesn't cover every eventuality. And we found even in the first year there are issues arising that weren't covered by the partnership agreement. And what we always said was, if we have to recourse to this agreement, we've sort of failed, because we should be able to agree things as partners without having to go to the book, as it were.
Okay, Ms Campbell, have you got any comment on that particular issue?
I think a lot of the success around the bill will be around effecting a culture shift in the way that both organisations work together. And I think in terms of money, there needs to be an openness and an open dialogue between partners to try and effect some of the shifts that need to happen, and the realism around how that can be done. So I would agree that that there does need to be a high level of openness and transparency in order to make it work, and getting the key people in there is obviously going to be pivotal to ensuring that that's done.
I'm just about to go back to you, Mr Kenton, but carry on.
Yeah, just to add to that, one of the things we found in the first year was, even with that level of openness and trust, there were times when we were almost not talking the same language from the accounting point of view, because the regimes are so different, and that was a real learning experience, which we've tried to sort of help with colleagues who are interested in. If they were interested in our model, we would sort of be happy to share those experiences. But we were almost, as I said, found out we were talking a different language, and the accounting regimes were different. So sometimes there was misunderstandings more than disagreements, and we had to work through those as we went along.
Okay, thank you. I was going to go on to talk about some of the wider issues that have been discussed. I mean, you say, Mr Kenton, that the wider financial consequences of integration are difficult to quantify, but our belief is that these will be beneficial rather than a cost burden. However, prior to that, you've also said that the bill does not seem to make provision for the potential costs of transferring ownership of assets or long-term leasing of assets. And you've also pointed out that the potential efficiencies from reducing delayed discharges, which we've touched on already, reducing variation and anticipated care plans are presumably based on full cost estimates, which are therefore not fully realisable unless fixed costs are reduced as a result of these changes. I mean, do you think there is an opportunity to reduce those fixed costs? And I wonder if you can comment a wee bit wider on these matters.
I think there is an opportunity to reduce fixed costs. I think it's very challenging. I think it's a medium to long term goal, and we always said when we went down our integration route that the first 2 years would be about bedding in, and almost business as usual was the phrase we used, because transferring £89 million and 1,500 staff one way and £200 million, £8 million and 200 staff the other way, and all the pensions, payroll, or the accounting treatments were transferred as well. There was real capacity for things to go wrong, and so the first year or two I think is just bedding down. But clearly, by having all the resources for adult services in one place in the health service, and that would, we hope, bring opportunities. But we touched upon the demographic pressures earlier, so it's not clear yet that maybe just holding the line in terms of acute spend might be a good result, because we're looking at demographic increases and pressures in the acute sector. So we're not yet confident to say we can take large amounts of fixed costs out of the acute sector. That's untested. So I think, but what we are confident about is having all the resources in one place can only help with that. In terms of the property, that is really a feature of the differences in the accounting regime. So even if Highland Council, at the moment we're delivering services from care homes that remain owned by Highland Council. So the services we deliver from there are delivered by staff who we now employ. They moved over from Highland Council. But the Highland Council still own those buildings. We would like to lease them or own them. But even if our Highland Council wished to sell them to us for £1, which they might be prepared to do, the accounting regime in the NHS doesn't allow that to happen very easily. So we're working with colleagues in the Scottish Government to try and find a way around that. So it's the actual transfer itself would be a cost. And also in the NHS, when you own an asset, you pay a cost called depreciation on it. In the local government system, that is sort of a notional cost. In our system, it's a real cost. So there's significant differences in the accounting regimes, which is, at the moment, that's probably the biggest barrier in accounting terms to being able to move forward. But we're working closely with colleagues in the Scottish Government to try to resolve that.
Campbell, have you got any comment to make on that particular issue?
Well, obviously, we don't have the same experience that they do have in Highland, but I think from obviously integrating, there will be natural efficiencies that come from that around, you know, your management posts, for example. If you are co-locating, you know, it makes the delivery of services much more real for people, and obviously there's efficiencies that come from that. I think there's a lot that could be maybe done around ICT systems and trying to integrate that a lot more, streamlining processes. You know, things like inputting information once would be a lot more efficient. But in terms of, you know, some of the bigger costs in terms of shifting resource from the acute sector, and you know, whether that might eventually result in ward closures or, you know, closure of buildings and those kind of things. I think that's probably quite a long way away, and probably quite aspirational in terms of the demographic pressures that we have, and the fact that, you know, even if we are able to free up beds and those kind of aspects, then there are other areas of pressure within the health service just now that, you know, we quite easily, I think, suck up that kind of resource for other means. So I think that there are natural efficiencies that can be made in terms of assets and maybe co-location and ICT systems, but certainly the bigger aim around wards and hospitals and beds is probably more longer term.
Okay, thank you. And I just want to ask one more question before I let the committee in, which is to you, Ms Campbell, although Mr Kenton can of course comment, and it's just about the potential equal pay claims for staff working more closely together. What concerns do you have on that particular issue?
Well, I think there were provisions within the bill that if we went down the lead commissioning model, that obviously with rafts of staff to paying over, there's a natural maybe a harmonisation of pay claims that might go on there. But I think as teams naturally come together, there are differences in paying conditions between OTs, for example, and if you had an integrated occupational therapy team, then there could be some potential that people look at counterparts in maybe health or counterparts in local authorities who are maybe on a more advantageous terms and conditions, and it might naturally come with pay claims around that. But again, it's maybe not as instant as what you would see under a lead commissioning model, but certainly under a body corporate model, it is something as teams come together, it might present an issue.
Just wondering, given the size of Greater Glasgow and Clyde, for example, I'm just wondering what your view in an area like that would be. You know, what you have any idea what kind of the cost implications could be?
I mean, I couldn't comment on
the
scale of Glasgow. No.
Mr. Kenton, you've obviously got more experience in this kind of area, and that Highland is much further down the road. What's your own view of this?
I think it is a risk. Certainly worth pointing that out. We're proceeding with caution, I think, is how I would summarise it. So we don't have a policy of harmonisation. What we are doing, though, is where posts become vacant or there's a redesign, then where we can, we're starting to move posts over to, you know, the relevant pay scale for the new employer. But we're doing it with caution.
Okay, now I'm going to open out the session to colleagues round the table, and the first person to ask questions will be Malcolm, to be followed by the Deputy Convener, John.
I mean, I agree with Nick Kenton. I think he said that integration can mitigate the effects of demographic change, although I suppose that is if integration works properly in terms of shifting the balance of care, which structural change in itself won't deliver. But assuming that it does shift the balance of care, I don't really agree with you that demography is irrelevant, because surely the whole implication of the financial memorandum is that, you know, savings of quite large sums of money can be delivered by reducing delayed discharge, by anticipatory care plans, and reducing variations. Or people might want to comment on what that actually involves as well, but we would all agree that reducing delayed discharge and anticipatory care plans are a good thing, but surely because of the demography, there's no way it will reduce those savings. So in that sense, the financial memorandum is highly misleading.
Yeah, I mean, I think I think my answer probably wasn't quite expressed as I meant it. What I meant was, when Jean Campbell spoke about the demographics need to be in there as a cost of the bill, my point was, well, those costs will happen whether the bill happens or not, so it's not directly relevant to the cost of the bill, but it's a relevant part of the context, I think, as you're suggesting, that we need to be aware of this, and for me that's one of the issues in support of the bill.
Would you like to go? Would you agree with that?
No, I mean, I think that was certainly the context within which we made the comment, is that it would be relevant to see the extent of the demographic growth if you're going to be allocating savings or efficiencies against that, to see the extent that integration would go to dealing with some of the issues that are around. But clearly, you know, there needs to be further consideration about how we meet the pressures around demographic growth, and integration will go some way to address that. But it would have been helpful, I think, within the financial memorandum to have seen the extent of the issue that we're dealing with over the next 20 years if we're going to be predicating efficiency savings against it.
Well, I mean, obviously, if you fully understand that, I mean, the problem is a lot of local authority submissions to the bill assume that, you know, resources can be released to a significant extent from acute budgets in order to pay for the development of services in the community, and it seems to me that's really going to be very misleading if people think that that is going to be possible given the demography. I mean, it may be more possible in some parts of Scotland than others. It certainly isn't possible in Lothian given the demography we have. But I mean, I wonder, I suppose it's more to the Nick Kenton with his health experience, to what extent Highland, for example, has or would be able to release money from acute budgets in order to shift the balance of care.
I think that is our aim, but at the moment we don't have a timescale for it. As I said, this is a medium to long-term issue. We're looking at keeping the ship steady for 2 years before we try anything sort of clever, as it were. So I don't have a glib answer to that, but it's something which we would want to do, and we think by having all the resources in one place, it's more likely to happen than if there's organisational divisions between the resources.
And given that quite a lot of the savings are said to come from reducing variation, I mean, that puzzled me as well, because I suppose variation might be a good or a bad thing. It might be a bad thing because the service was inefficient. It might be a good thing because it was a better service. So I would be interested in your comments on savings from reducing variation.
I think my view of variation is we should be looking at variation across the whole of the NHS and indeed local government, not just in the context of integration. And so certainly in Highland, that's one thing we need to focus on. And you're absolutely right. Sometimes variation is completely appropriate, but we need to understand that and bring it to light and challenge it.
Okay, that's all just now. Thanks.
Okay, John, to be followed by Michael.
Thanks very much. I mean, one of the things that strikes me in all of this is that we start off with 2 organisations, local government and health board, and we end up with 3. And that, on the surface, might mean it becomes even more expensive because there's more bureaucracy, and before a pound is spent, it has to be approved 3 times instead of just twice. Is that a wrong assumption?
Not sure who you're directing the question
Well,
at.
both of you, yes.
In the lead agency model, there is still 2 statutory bodies, and I think even under the terms of the bill, the situation we have in Highland wouldn't need to change much. We would need a joint committee, and we already have a strategic commissioning group, which is joint between the 2 organisations, which looks fairly similar to the joint committee. So under the Highland model, you still have only 2 statutory bodies.
Is the Highland model, so effectively you've transferred between yourselves? Yes. You've not set up really a third organisation to do it all. But Correct. One of the suggestions is there could be a third organisation set up to do it all.
In terms of the other model, yes, I think that's correct. But maybe a question for the Scottish Government.
Ask you why you didn't go down that route.
Well, at the time we considered our model, the legislation wasn't in place for the model we've gone down is under the terms of the 2002 Act, so it's under existing legislation. I think when the model was first looked at in December 2010, a third-party model was considered. I'm not sure at the time whether that would have required legislation, but certainly the view taken was by having another body, you're putting more boundaries in the system rather than just trying to eliminate the boundaries. So.
That's very much the point I was kind of trying to make, that's right, you put more. I mean, is that a concern, Ms Campbell?
I suppose it will be key what the guidance says on the issue and how much autonomy this body corporate would have. And I think certainly from the bill, it would seem that it's going to have quite a lot of autonomy to make decisions around the pots of money that are allocated to it. So it can set quite clear direction around how resources are allocated across the whole landscape in order to meet key outcomes. But obviously in agreeing those key outcomes, both the bodies that sit at the back in terms of the local authority and health will need to agree what those outcomes are, will need to agree what the strategic or joint strategic commissioning plan would be around how those resources are allocated. And obviously each year, as we move into our own separate budget processes, we will have efficiencies applied to the budget. So while it's a separate entity that might have quite a lot of autonomy, I think there will be concerns around the fact that there will be 2 separate bodies sitting in the background who will have a say over the level of money that goes in and the direction that money needs to take, that there can't be a completely autonomous body that makes decisions that are without regard to 2 separate bodies. So I think it will create some additional level of bureaucracy, I would think.
I mean, I must say I find that a bit concerning. So, I mean, at the moment, if you've got £10 million, say, in social work, social work basically decides that and how it's going to be spent. In future, that £10 million would potentially be transferred to this new organisation. So, I suppose my question is then, how hands-on will social work be about that £10 million? Will they just hand it over and let the new body get on with it? Or are they actually going to be quite involved in how that money is spent?
Well, I think guidance will be key in how that money is dealt with once it's transferred over. But the council may transfer £10 million over, but when it comes to the next year, the council might have 3% efficiencies to make. So it might have to go through an exercise where it deducts 3% from the 10 million that it's allocated in, or has some sort of process in place about how it allocates efficiencies, or asks the body corporate for those kind of efficiencies. So there will need to be dialogue between the council and this body corporate about the level of funding that goes in, the extent to which it'll have a say over what happens to that funding when it goes in. I think will be within the guidance and how autonomous that body has to make those kind of decisions. And from the bill, it would suggest that it will be quite autonomous, but obviously as the years go on, it will have to meet the pressures that are on its parent bodies in terms of efficiencies or anything that goes on in the background. It will have to comply with those kind of efficiencies in the same way that money's allocated to education or sports and leisure. Everybody has to contribute to the bigger agenda that's going on in terms of the overall council strategy and the overall health strategy. So it will be quite autonomous, and it will be able to do what it likes, maybe with the 10 million that it has, but as the years go on, it will have to make the efficiencies that the parent bodies have to deliver on as well.
Follow that point as well. And I mean, in your case, you're a relatively small council,
yeah.
and you're dealing with, is it Greater Glasgow and Clyde? Health Board, right? And will there be one joint body then for the whole of Greater Glasgow and Clyde?
Well, that's still to be determined.
That's not determined. Right?
So the way the bill stands just now, each local authority area should have its own partnership agreement. So we would expect that Eastern Bartonshire will have its own partnership agreement, but obviously in terms of hospital provision, we are sharing that with 6 other local authorities. So
your council will be interested that the £10 million you put into the pot is actually benefiting your residents as compared to Lanarkshire residents, or, well, yes. In Lanarkshire it would be, say, Renfrewshire, something like that.
Glasgow residents. Yes, absolutely.
Right, okay, thanks.
Mr. Kenton wanted to...
Sorry, yes, I knew it. Okay.
Just to add to that, again reflecting on the experience in Highland, we've had a debate with the council when they transferred the 89 million as to how much influence, control or otherwise the council would have over that, and there was a debate about whether we should be focusing on the inputs, i.e. the staff and all the budgets transferred over, or the outcomes. So I think we're in a state of flux, but I think our preference is we should be talking about the outcomes. What have we delivered with that 89 million, rather than how many social workers have been appointed or whatever. So that's not resolved yet, but I think that's I think as we mature, I'd hope we move towards looking at the outcomes each of the other agencies has delivered, rather than focusing on the exact amounts transferred. There
was a point I made, and I realise neither of you is probably directly answerable for this, but I can ask it anyway. The whole idea of the bodies that would come in and do the inspections and so on, which, as I understand it, is Healthcare Improvement Scotland and the Care Inspectorate, and there would potentially be a bit of duplication in there as well. Is that your understanding, that they would both be doing the same thing, or do they do different things?
Well, they currently do different things. Obviously, the Health Inspectorate will look at the quality of the health aspects, and the Care Inspectorate look at the quality issues around the social care delivery. But my understanding is that they are moving down a joint inspection route, and certainly we've just had a joint inspection for our child protection services within Eastern Bartonshire. So it does look at how organisations are working together jointly to deliver on outcomes, and the Care Inspectorate are certainly moving themselves to kind of deliver on that kind of approach. So I think if that kind of approach continues, it maybe would eradicate some of the duplication that's out there just now. But I did know that there were cost implications.
Being slightly sceptical, I mean, that sounds like 2 people are turning up to inspect something together, which is probably better than turning up separately. But then ultimately, would it be better if just one person turned up and did the inspection, and then there'd be a saving of 50%?
Yeah, I mean, hopefully that's the way it will go. I mean, just now it was the Care Inspectorate that came in and looked at, so it was one body that came in and looked at the whole joint landscape in terms of how we deliver on child protection, and how we work jointly to deliver on those outcomes. So when the Health Inspectorate would come along, you would hope that they would have cognisance of that inspection that had gone on, and that might inform the level of inspection that they might have to do around that particular area within their own organisation. But as things move on, you would hope that would be able to come together a lot more.
Is that your view as well, Mr. Kenton, that it'll be longer term before they kind of join up?
I mean, I guess I'm not sure if we have a formal organisational view on that. So this is purely speaking personally, then joining up and being integrating the sort of care, the inspectorate regime at the same time you integrate care itself seems to make sense. But I think on the other hand, we must make sure we don't lose the expertise. So, for example, if the NHS is running care homes, we need to make sure that the standards applied aren't the ones that apply to hospitals. Otherwise, you'll end up with inappropriate sort of responses to that. So I think, yes, in principle, it makes sense to join things up, but let's make sure we keep the appropriateness of the inspectorate regime for each part of the organisation.
Okay, thanks. And I think, final point, just to yourself, I mean, when the experience you've gone through bringing the two organisations together, or at least doing work jointly, I mean, did you have big financial input from outside on that, or were you able to cover that within your own resources?
We had support from the Scottish Government to the tune of about 1.5 million, of which 900,000, around 900,000 was to do with the direct costs of transition. And because we were sort of, I guess, first in the queue, there's some costs which won't apply to other organisations. And also because of the model we went down, we had some costs around, say, HR support, which wouldn't necessarily apply to the model. We also had some support. The rest of the support was around differences in the accounting regime. So, for example, in the health service, when staff get to the end of a financial year, they carry their leave forward. In the health service, you have to make a provision for that as if it were to be paid, which is just an accounting requirement which doesn't exist in the council. So there were some transitional changes which we needed help to cover. So that was the sort of the scale of it.
Trying to get the accountants to behave themselves better.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Michael.
Thanks very much, Convener. I'd like the Deputy Convener, I'm interested in the organisational development. And in the Financial Memorandum at paragraph 53, it says that support will be necessary at all levels in the new partnership, including the establishment of new integration joint boards or integration joint monitoring committees, through to education and training for frontline practitioners working in new ways to support service users. And I think that's a sort of statement of fact, but in terms of the Financial Memorandum, do you think that the costs of that organisational redevelopment is taken into account? And what would the implications be for the establishment of these new bodies?
Some of the costs have been reflected within the Financial Memorandum in terms of the appointment of joint accountable officers and the displacement costs around the CHP managers, which under the legislation those posts will go. What I don't think has been included is a reciprocal provision within the local authority side, because there will be management or leadership posts which will go under those arrangements, and there will be management structures which will come underneath where there'll need to be a joining up of health and social work management teams to deliver on the agenda, and no reflection of the fact that there could be redundancy and displacement of costs within the local authority for those arrangements as well.
Point of view, Mr. Kenton?
Well, in the Highland model, there's no new body to staff up. So, I mean, we have had to restructure on the back of integration, but that's been broadly cost neutral for us. In terms of training for frontline staff, I'm not aware of any new costs because, you know, as I said in one of my earlier answers, as far as the frontline staff are concerned, the initial 2 years is business as usual. They're now paid from a different, payroll, they're part of a different organisation, but the frontline care they're delivering is pretty much the same. So I don't see that there's a particular issue around training for them in the short term.
Money is going to be overall the whole of Scotland. And have you looked at the situation in terms of the Financial Memorandum overall, rather than just from your own perspective? Because if you're talking about all of the health boards, all of the local authorities, there will be cost implications in these changes, and we've got to look from our perspective at whether these cost implications have been taken into account by the Scottish Government when they're planning the financial arrangements for it.
I mean, I can only answer from the Highland point of view, so I think it's probably a question for the Scottish Government officials who are on after us.
We appear to have no further questions from members of the committee, so I'm just going to finish off with a couple of questions, one to each of you, but of course you can both, of course, comment on those. And it's Ms Campbell, in terms of your own submission, you say that under delayed discharge is something we've touched on already. You say they're predicated on a maximum of 14-day delay in hospital, and you ask, is this realistic and achievable? So it's just to ask both of you whether you believe this is realistic and achievable.
I think to establish if it's achievable, it would be helpful to look at the position across Scotland and how successful partnerships are just now in achieving the 28-day target. I know certainly within our own authority, under the 6 weeks, we had no delayed discharges at all. In the months leading up to, in the first initial months of the year, we did experience some delay for the 28-day target, but obviously are now achieving that. I think that the bill itself reflects alternate costs around care homes and home care as opposed to hospital admissions in terms of identifying efficiencies around that. But I think what it doesn't recognise is the assessment teams, for example, who have to run twice as fast to undertake assessments and get people out of hospital within the 28 days. And to go to 14 days, I think, is asking a lot of, from my own perspective, social work teams to be able to deliver on those kind of assessments within that timescale. So while I think within East Dunbartonshire we're relatively successful in terms of attaining the targets around daily discharge, I'm aware that it's not as consistent as that across Scotland, and I think if you want to reflect realistic expectations around that, then you might consider looking at how other partnerships are achieving the target of the 28 days just now, and obviously as that moves to 14 days it becomes more and more difficult for teams to physically get people out within those timescales.
So Kenton, realistic and achievable?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's not my direct area of expertise, but what I can say, we certainly have set ourselves a target which would beat that target. Having said that, at the moment we do have issues with delayed discharges, and the way we're looking at that is to look at care home capacity and care at home capacity. And I think, again, one of the things I would say is now that that is under our direct control, it's within our gift to sort of address that, and we could, if we were able to sort of move resources to address that, whereas in the past we'd be sort of negotiating with the council about how we have a joint response. So I think our system should make it more doable, but that isn't to say that it's not a challenge. I think there is some evidence from, I think it's the Torbay model, which has a model similar to the Highland model, where they have, I don't have the figures to hand, but I believe they have had some fairly sort of good results on delayed discharges by going down the integration approach.
Okay, thank you. And my final question is to you, Mr. Kenton, although again Ms Campbell can comment subsequently. You say in your response that it's important to have sufficient local discretion to achieve the objectives the government has set out, and you go on to talk about a level of flexibility, and then you say, and I quote, the emphasis should be on functions and not services per se to ensure that the total resource required to deliver that function is included in the integrated pot. I just wonder if you can expand a wee bit more on that.
I think it probably relates back to one of my earlier points, that I don't think you can try and legislate for everything and write everything down, and although we have a 400-page partnership agreement, it doesn't cover all the eventualities. So we do need to encourage flexibility and for partnerships to find their own local solutions. I think the wording in our response is a bit clunky. I think we should have been referred to outcomes rather than functions. So what we're saying, instead of saying functions rather than services, we should have said outcomes rather than services. So rather than getting hung up on the minutiae of the budget transfer, let's talk about what outcomes does our partnership wish to see.
Thank you. Ms Campbell, anything you want to comment on?
Well, obviously I think we do need to focus on outcomes and what is it we need to deliver on those particular outcomes. I think it is hard to get away from the practicalities around transfers and partnership agreements and all of the minutiae that needs to go around to make that happen. But obviously at the front line you have older people, and I think we need to do the best for these people, and they don't want to be in hospital, and they want good quality care at home services. So if those are some of the outcomes that we can deliver for older people, then obviously we need to look at what do we need within a pot to deliver on that.
Thank you. Now, just about to call the session to up, I just wonder if there's any further points that you feel you would like to make. You don't have to, but if there's anything further you'd like to make to committee before winding up this session.
No, thank you.
Okay, Ms Campbell?
No.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I really appreciate the responses that you've given to the questions that you were asked this morning. Thank you very much. I'll now call a short recess until 10:45. I shall call the session to order, and we will now continue to take evidence on the Public Bodies Joint Working Scotland Bill's Financial Memorandum from our second panel of witnesses this morning. Can I therefore welcome to the meeting from the Scottish Government Francis Conlan, Christine McLaughlin, Paul Leake and Alison Taylor. And there's not going to be any opening statements, so we're going to go straight into questions. And of course the first series of questions will be from myself, as usual, and then we'll open it out to the joys of convenership, and then we'll open it out to members of the committee, so colleagues around the table can let folk know when they wish to come in. So, the bill estimates potential efficiencies of between 138 million and 157 million pounds for health boards and local authorities from the combined effect of anticipated care plans, reduced delayed discharge and reduced variation. However, the financial memorandum itself also notes that, and I quote, there is considerable uncertainty around these estimates. And these uncertainties are acknowledged by a number of people who've submitted evidence to the committee. For example, Scottish Borders have said much more research and a robust evidence base will be needed. Dumfries and Galloway Council also said there's considerable uncertainty around the estimates in relation to projected efficiencies, etc. So I'm just wondering if you estimate how much uncertainty there actually is, and how you came to the figure that you have this relatively narrow range of between 138 and 157 million pounds. Who'd like to go first?
Shall I begin with a general statement from the policy aspect, and then I'll hand over to my colleagues who did the calculations? Would that be best?
Happy with that.
I think in terms of uncertainty, part of the challenge for us, obviously, and this is in common with all health and social care systems in developed countries, is that the issues at work are highly complex. And there is a wealth of evidence, but that in itself is complex. And drawing down what potential improvements are available is a fairly multifaceted calculation. But at that point, I'm going to hand over to my colleague Paul.
The estimates for efficiencies, as you know, across three areas: anticipatory care plans, reduction in delayed discharges, and reduction in variation. The range really just relates to the calculation for delayed discharges, because there was two assumptions there: 14 days and 72 hours. So that's that explains the difference in the range there. The basis of the calculation for variation is that we're able to track the expenditure by populations for health boards down to partnership areas. So, for instance, in Lothian, we can track how much expenditure from Lothian Health Board is being spent across the four partnerships in Lothian. And that shows that there's variation, even though there'll be an average spend per head across Lothian or Tayside or whatever. It shows variation in the spend per weighted head for the populations of the partnerships. So what we're indicating there is that through the integration proposals, that difference in expenditure per head will be evident to the partnership, and there'll be a basis for scrutiny of that. Now, what we're unsure about is the process and the decisions which the partnerships will then take in reviewing that information and then informing their allocations subsequently. So that's essentially the uncertainty in relation to that. It's more uncertainty about the decisions that will be taken by the partnerships than uncertainty around the figures themselves.
I need to drill down into that, so I shall avoid the temptation to ask further questions on that specific issue. But in terms of transitional non-recurrent costs, actually, it is reasonable to assume that health boards and local authorities will realise opportunity costs that will be expected to support transitional arrangements. I'm just wondering if you can tell us what these opportunity costs are likely to be. You can give me some more detail on that. Yes. I know that table's provided, but I'm just wondering if you can tell us a bit more for the record on that.
Yeah, in calculating the transition costs, the method we used was to take the Highland example, as Mr. Kenton indicated earlier, and then to remove from those costs which either don't apply to the bill, so for instance children's services costs, and then also costs which are specific to the lead agency model, to then allow us to get a transition cost estimate for the integrated joint board or the body corporate model. in carrying out that calculation, we understood from Highland that there were some costs which they incurred, which they didn't actually expend expenditure on. They're able to cover those costs by reallocating a resource from other areas within their programme, other budgets. So we noted that as a potential opportunity for other partnerships to follow in due course. But we didn't actually apply that in our calculations. So the estimate for our transition costs in the financial memo makes no assumptions for opportunity costs.
Okay, now in terms of some of the evidence from, for example, local authorities, East Dunbartonshire Council has said, and they've of course just given evidence to us, as you know, just before you've come in here, that there's no focus on the issues arising from the delegation of budgets and resources under each of the two options available, which is a key area of concern and will have far-reaching implications in the medium-longer term, and the realism attached to releasing resources from budgets tied into acute budget without destabilising hospital provision. I'm just wondering again if you can respond to that.
From my understanding of the response earlier, I think that was referring to the fact that we've not included in the bill the potential benefits of redesign of secondary care by specifically referring to that. You could argue that some of the potential efficiencies from delayed discharges reflects that. I don't know if you want anything else.
There's been some discussion very helpfully previously about the difficulties associated with releasing any resource from acute spend and the need to incorporate acute spending and activity in the, as I would describe it, in the strategic planning process that we're laying out for the integrated systems. I think the main focus in policy terms is that we don't believe we can deliver better outcomes for people unless we ensure a strategic planning process that reflects the entire journey of care. The assumptions that are worked in there about redesign of all types of provision, primary care, community care and hospital care, depend largely on local opportunity for improvement. I look to my colleague Christine to see if she would like to add more, though, from her health perspective.
Just in terms of, in the totality of the bill, that there's I think we're covering the overall approach in relation to scope. So if the point that's been made, and I know it's been made in a number of submissions, is about scope and the extent to which it's included within the financial memorandum, then I think we have set out the total spend on adults within the financial memorandum. What we haven't done is really specified in great detail the components of resources that will come within the scope of the plan. And that's work that has been taken forward through a group that I chair, which is the Integrated Resources Advisory Group, which includes directors of finance from local government and from health, at ADSW and Audit Scotland and other bodies, including SIPFA. So that's been taken forward as something that is about how you get the best use of the total resources, which is what we've tried to outline it very upfront in the financial memorandum, that this isn't just about what does it cost and what can you identify as tangible savings, but it's also about the wider question of how you make the best use of the total resources available. So that there is further work that will be able to be provided if you would be interested in it, that where we were asking partnerships to give us information on the scope of resources that each partnership is looking to put in to the overall scope of the plan, but that's not identified in the financial memorandum at this point in time. So I had a sense that that's where some of the responses were coming from, was that question about quantifying scope. I don't know if that answers your question.
To a degree it does. I mean, continuing on this issue of costs, actually, which of course is pretty fundamental in terms of the financial memorandum, a number of people who've submitted evidence, as you'll know, have basically commented that the costs on health bodies are more clearly identified and addressed than costs on local authorities. I'm just wondering why that is.
Start, if I can follow up. It's in part a reflection of the fact, obviously, that the financial memorandum reflects the costs incurred by the bill itself. And the bill itself, if and when enacted, takes community health partnerships off the statute book and therefore has a direct impact on management arrangements that have been in place in health boards to support community health partnerships. But I would invite my colleagues to supplement.
Yeah, it's just to say that we didn't have the time to consult on the financial memo, so we took the opportunity to work informally with ADSWA and COSLA to identify costs which may occur to local government, and we reflected all of those costs in the financial memo. We also used a resources advisory group which we've established to advise us on the resource implications of the bill. We didn't share the figures in detail with the group, but we shared all of the headings and areas of costs that we'd identified with the group to get a broader assessment of the costs that might apply. And certainly in relation to the transition costs, although we used Highland as the model, that was both partners in Highland, so we captured all of the costs which were incurred by both partners and then incorporated those with adjustments into the financial memo.
Now, in terms of the Association of Directors of Social Work you've just kind of touched on, they've concerns that in terms of management posts, they believe that they're more likely to be deleted than is being taken into consideration. And they've said potential redundancy and redeployment costs will be significantly larger, therefore, than those contained in the financial memorandum.
There's been some reflection from the previous witnesses and in other discussion around this, as you'll be aware, about the need to ensure flexibility for local systems to put in place arrangements that best suit local needs and which also provide a smooth and sustainable and robust transition from current patterns of provision to a more integrated model. We have worked closely with representatives of the Association of Directors of Social Work and other pertinent bodies in the formulation of these figures, as Paul indicated. And we haven't been able to fathom in detail what such changes might amount to in a general sense, because they do tend to be quite particular to local systems. Would anybody wish to add to that?
Just in the calculation specifically around the displacement of CHP general managers, some of those posts are part funded by boards and local authorities. Most are in boards, but some are part funded by boards and local authorities. So the estimate of the displacement cost in relation to those posts addresses the cost that would be incurred by both boards and local authorities. But the calculation is just in relation to CHP general managers, as they're the posts that are directly affected by the bill.
Now, North Ayrshire, which is the area of my own constituency, as they've commented on the issue of insufficient ICT developments and recurring costs being considered. So, for example, in my area, we've got 3 local authorities with coterminous boundaries within one health board. But they say that within Ayrshire, 3 local authorities operate different social work management information systems. Now, when you look at Greater Glasgow and Clyde, for example, that's going to be even greater, not maybe so much in Lanarkshire. So I'm just wondering what has been taken into account in terms of financial implications, because clearly there is concern that it hasn't really been given the consideration that these local authorities think it should have had.
In the financial memo, we've included costs specifically for a project to improve management information to support strategic planning. So strategic planning is a key proposal in the bill. And the information we've used to support the figures in the financial memo are based on a project which we've had underway for a number of years called the Integrated Resource Framework, which it links health and social care data at a individual client patient level, and then aggregates that up to larger geographies, GP practices or CHP boundaries or districts for local authority. So we've based the figures in the financial memo on work that's actually underway, and we're proposing to roll out that work to all partnerships in Scotland, so that by the time the bill is implemented, we'll have linked health and social care management data which can be used by partnerships to inform the strategic planning. And so the figures we've included are based on work, actual costs incurred at the moment, just scaled up. The process doesn't involve a standardisation of systems. It essentially uses existing systems, draws the data in and presents it back to partners in a way which they can access.
Thanks for that, it's very helpful.
Sorry, just the other component of that, I know a number of responses talked along the lines of perhaps thinking that there was a need for a new IT system, and certainly the experience in health over the last 5 years or so has been very much about convergence of systems as opposed to creating new systems, focusing on standardisation of the clinical information as well as the data itself. And so this approach very much fits with that wider e-health strategy of taking existing systems and accepting that sometimes the answer isn't a one-size-fits-all system for every part of the country. So that's the straightforward answer as to why we haven't included a very large multi-million-pound figure for IT systems at this point in time.
Okay, thank you. I just want to touch on one further point actually before opening the session out into to committee, and that's the clinical negligence and other risks scheme, which goes by the acronym of CNORIS. Not an acronym I think many of us were probably familiar with before we came to this bill. And just to comment on one of the submissions, Falkirk Council notes that, and I quote, in respect of clinical negligence and other risks insurance, the FM notes that the cost of obtaining indemnity from the market might be prohibitive, but makes no mention of additional costs that might arise from extension of the scheme. So I'm just wondering if you can talk us through that your thinking on this particular area, and with regard to additional costs, if you can perhaps tell us what those might be.
The Sonoris scheme, as it's known, isn't an insurance scheme as such. It's a risk-sharing scheme, and so it's mandatory across all NHS boards. And basically what it does is allow the total cost of claims in any 1 year to be shared on an agreed basis across all of the members. And it currently doesn't allow social care functions to be provided within it. So the reason for it being in the bill is to extend the provision so that if anyone wished local authorities wish to join the scheme for the functions that are defined in the bill, that they can do. And so in terms of additional costs, because it's not like a premium that you're putting in place, it's just about sharing costs. So the way that I would envisage it would work if social care functions were included is that we would need to have a way of identifying the risk associated with those services to be able to attribute total costs incurred in any 1 year across all members. So that it's unlikely to be additional costs as we would see it, and in fact the reason that it was put into being in the NHS was to try to make best use of resources and avoid anyone having to hold reserves for any potential high value claims, so that you have a kind of smoothing effect across all of the service. So I think that there's the going out to market for services in health doesn't make a great deal of financial sense because of the potential for high value claims in areas such as obstetrics. So potentially this would just allow those functions to benefit from the same kind of risk sharing agreements. But the strength in the NHS scheme right now is that all boards work to very similar clinical risk management standards and procedures, and so that going forward you would want to maintain that integrity for anyone joining the scheme. I've also had some discussions with some other people asking about the scheme more generally, and there's nothing to prohibit anyone else looking to set up a similar type of scheme for other functions, but we've very much focused on the functions that are within the scope of the bill itself.
Okay, thank you for that comprehensive response. I'm going to open the session out to colleagues now, and it will be Malcolm to followed by Michael.
If I could start with the reducing variation issue, I mean, Paul Leake was helpful about that and giving the loathing example, but I'm still kind of struggling to see how it works, and given that's probably that's the largest potential efficiency, I genuinely don't really understand it. And you yourself said, you know, there would be uncertainties about the decisions taken by the partnership. But I mean, sticking with your loathing example, it's not clear to me how it would be different from there's variation between the 4 local authorities, but there's 4 different partnership boards, so I'm not quite sure how the bill's going to change anything fundamentally in that regard.
We were very careful when we were considering these figures for the financial memo, in that we started off by looking at the variation in health and social care expenditure across partnership populations, but were aware of the fact that some of the variation in local authority expenditure per head might be due to political decisions, and so we took that out of the equation. which left us with the variation across partnership areas in health board expenditure. So if I just stick with the Lothian example, that gave us 4 expenditure figures per head of population for the partnerships in Lothian, which averages out at what Lothian's spend per head is across the whole of the Lothian population. And the premise is that through the partnership, the provisions in the bill and the establishment of the partnerships, that variation will be apparent. It's apparent, I think, in some boards at the moment, but it's perhaps a marginal issue. We think this will give it more prominence, and that it will at least allow the potential for partners to scrutinise why expenditure per head in Edinburgh City is different to expenditure per head, say, in Mid-Lothian, and to compare what the outcomes are that are being achieved for that additional expenditure per head, draw some conclusions from that, and hopefully then inform their strategic planning decisions in due course. So what I tried to explain earlier about the uncertainty in the figures is we're unsure about the decisions partnerships will take when they're presented with that information. So we're saying there's potential, there is variation there, there's potential efficiencies, but it's up to partners to then act on that.
Well, I mean, I won't pursue it. I'm just sceptical because we already have separate partnership boards in Lothian, so I'm not quite sure why they wouldn't be able to do that now if they wanted to.
I suppose the question is that information being reported at the moment? I'm not sure it is. So this is the total health and social care expenditure on adults in Mid-Lothian and in West Lothian, etc. At the moment, I think all that's reported is the direct budgets that are being managed by the CHPs, whereas this will include the use of all of the services by the population, and that shows quite material variation.
Okay, I mean, it leads me to my next point, because you're saying the uncertainty about decisions taken by partnerships, but I suppose this also goes to the financial heart of the bill. Will it just be decisions taken by partnerships? Because surely the totality of the resource they have is not going to be determined by the partnership, it's going to be determined by the council and the health board. And I suppose, I totally agree with the objectives of the bill and really everything that you've said about this is, best use of total resources and all that kind of thing, but it's still not clear to me in practice how the... Well, I suppose my question really is, is the government quite comfortable, it's perhaps a policy question, just allowing that, health boards and local authorities 32 times in Scotland deciding how much money goes in, because that's going to be fundamental to all this, and particularly, of course, how much goes in from acute. Mm-hmm. I don't quite see how that's all going to work in practice in a kind of equitable way, and I just wonder whether there is a case for having more central direction about how much goes into the integrated budget.
Shall I answer from a technical side and then, or do you want to?
Yeah, I think there are several points there that we might want to... You start. Alison can address policy issues. This resource advisory group, which we've established, is producing professional guidance for boards and local authorities, finance leaders, in terms of how they set their budgets and the process for setting the initial budget and subsequent budgets. And that will set out all the factors which should be considered by the partners in deciding what's in the budget. And one of those factors will be any movement by the parent bodies to remove some of the variation. So in the discussions between the partnership and the parent bodies about the subsequent allocation to the partnership, one of the factors will be you're allocating £50 a head less to our partnership than you are to the next door partnership, and yet we're being asked to achieve the same outcomes. And then the discussion about what can be amended so that's the process. It's that discussion between the parent bodies and the chief officer in the partnership about the resource which is being allocated.
No one's going to go to the parent body and say you're allocating us £50 more than the next one.
Well, that's the challenge for the parent body to say actually we're allocating you £50 more than before. We're setting you a differential efficiency target to achieve the same outcomes. Anyway.
I think Christian may want to speak about how the local integrated budgets are arrived at and agreed, and the interaction and support with local partnerships that we're putting in place around that. I was actually going to step back a couple of sentences to the discussion about variation in particular, and just to bring back a point that Paul made a few minutes ago about the investment we're making in improving provision of linked data at local level, which, as Paul said, will go below the level of a partnership as we work through this process and as we build on the experience of the integrated resource framework. One of the things that I think we learned from that experience, which is ongoing, is that there is a great opportunity from the data that comes out of that work for local professionals, local clinicians, to look at variation between their own practices. And that's absolutely not an area that a bureaucrat would wish to be involved in saying this kind of variation is good, this kind of variation suggests something isn't going right. But our colleagues who are senior clinicians, senior medical officers, etc., have certainly been involved in conversations at local level, leading conversations at local level, reflecting on variation in spend, activity and outcomes and what it means for local practice. And given the extent to which it's obviously through primary care that we see a lot of unplanned admissions, I think that kind of transparency around activity and what's going on ought to be helpful in improving quality and outcomes, particularly for frail elderly population. But on the subject of acute budgets, I shall hand over to Christine.
I think the point I was going to make is that through all the discussions that we've had on this, I think it's become evident that there are two different ways to approach it. You can focus your efforts on how much is in the pot. You can focus your efforts on the outcomes that are going to be delivered. And I think we've got to the point of thinking that it is more productive to focus on the outcomes. But as you'll know, there are very well-defined performance management arrangements in place for both local authorities and for health. And so delivery of outcomes will be very integral to that whole performance management arrangement. So I don't think that we're saying that we're leaving it entirely to the discretion of local partnerships, and that if we weren't seeing the traction that we expect to see in terms of outcomes, then that would just fall within normal performance management arrangements that already exist. But the point that Alison's making, I guess, both on transparency of information, but also an ability to compare and benchmark, is something that certainly within Scottish Government we are anticipating a lot more investment in time and energy and focus across both NHS and local government more generally than just this part of spend. But there's a real benefit in having that kind of much more manageable information that will allow better decision making. So I think when you put all that together, yes, it's important to make sure that there's enough within the scope to make sure that the partnerships really work, but I think we would prefer to focus our efforts on the extent to which what's in scope delivers the outcomes that are required.
So my last question is back to the...
Paul, just come back in there, Malcolm, sorry, just before you ask.
Sorry, it's just to really emphasise Christine's point there. So the main focus from the hospital provision of the bill is unplanned admissions. There's a significant proportion of our hospital capacity is unplanned admission, particularly of elderly people. And so we will, through I don't know if it's regulations but we'll target particular specialties for partners to include within the scope of the strategic plan. There's a relatively small number of specialties are responsible for most of the unplanned admission bed days for elderly people, and so we will, through the bill provisions, direct partners to include that within the minimum scope.
Well, I mean, that leads on to my last question, because I think the most difficult question is about the acute budgets, and I think I was struck particularly when the East Dunbartonshire representative was here, thinking of how many different local authorities, Greater Glasgow and Clyde, are having to negotiate with, and I'm kind of just finding it difficult in practice to see how that will work. And maybe it implies in your last question that you're going to give guidance or direction about which aspects of hospital budgets will have to be included. But I suppose it's back to the demographic point, because obviously we all accept the objectives around delayed discharges and anticipatory care, but the specialities that you're thinking about in hospital will still have all their beds filled because of demographics. So it's not as if, the only way, it seems to me, the thinking of the bill is kind of based on a stable elderly population, and then you can genuinely reduce hospital beds and build up community services. But certainly from what everybody tells me at Lothian is we have to We have to obviously increase community provision, but at best keep hospital beds at present. They're increasing the number of acute beds in Lothian at the same time as they're having step-down beds. So the point is, it's not clear to me, how these, firstly, whether the thinking of the savings is right, but secondly, how in practice you can put acute budgets in, or are you just basically saying each health board will put, in terms of acute services, will put in, or I don't see how they can put any of acute in some cases, but are you saying they will put in a small amount of money in order to help provide more community provision? But what's that going to do? Well, this is, as you must know, it's the NHS concern about the bill. What's that going? And Glasgow is a good example. If they've got however many local authorities it is, all trying to chip away at their health budget, and yet they're still going to have to run all the same hospitals with the same number of beds, one of which is currently being rebuilt. I just don't see in practice how that's going to work.
I think I'll just cover some technical things, and the focus of the bill is for partners to better use the resources across the whole of the spectrum of care. At the moment, we have quite artificial disconnects between community and acute provision within boards, and then between boards and local authorities, all of which affect the expenditure in each of those sectors. So the premise in the bill is that by bring that all together and focusing on all of that together, we can better allocate that resource. So through that process, we think there are efficiencies to be made, efficiencies that we've indicated in the financial memo, and also when we compare the performance of our systems with the integrated system down in the other parts of the UK, Torbay Care Trust, for instance, North East Lincolnshire, who have much, much lower bed day rates than our system, we think there are efficiencies to be made in terms of reallocating resources. What that won't do, though, is be sufficient to offset the demographic change, and we indicated that in the financial memo. So this is about using the resources we've got more efficiently now and planning strategic across the whole of the sectors for that better use of resource.
Yes, thanks. I would slightly reiterate what Paul has said about, and it goes back to a point I made earlier as well, actually. It's not really about handing money over, it's about bringing money together to reflect the journey of care for the growing population of need, which is largely people who are frail and in their older years, but also other adults who have multiple complex needs. And what we're trying to focus on particularly is the importance of a strategic planning effort across primary care, social care, and aspects of acute hospital care, which we believe potentially particularly lend themselves to be redesigned in favour of prevention. The key here is the bringing together rather than the handing over. And as Paul says, there is obviously an unknown quantity here. It's a large unknown quantity that's been reflected on quite a lot this morning about what the opportunity for redirection, reprovision is. But we do believe there is evidence to suggest that there is opportunity. In terms of the job given to us, if you like, in bringing together this policy and bringing together this legislation, the primary aim has been to seek a mechanism to make much better use of the current envelope of resource, because if we don't make better, more efficient use of what we have now, we certainly won't be equipped to deal with demographic change. But as Paul says, we noted, in particularly around paragraphs 34 and 35 of the Financial Memorandum, that we note and reflect on the impact of demographic change more broadly. Christine, would you wish to add?
No, I think that's...
But I mean, surely we bring together now, you're actually setting up a corporate body, then you are handing over. What happens now is bringing together, but what you're proposing is a step on from that, isn't it, where you have a body which is actually in a certain sense separate from the health boards and the local authorities.
Certainly, as we reflected upon how you can integrate in the broadest, most straightforward sense, it struck us that to reflect upon what Mr. Kenton said earlier, you can follow the kind of model that Highland has used, which has been used down south to good effect in some places, where, to put it in its very, very simplest terms, one body hands something to the other and the other body leads, and the money and the functions go together in that way. Or you could, we reasoned, take a different path, and you could bring functions and resources together by creating something in the middle of the health board and the local authority, if you like, a sort of overlap within a Venn diagram, something like that. And that's what we've sought to do. But I would challenge the idea that it is separate from the health board and the local authority. The governance arrangements that we have in mind, that we have described in the accompanying material that we have started to outline in appropriate terms for legislation, have a clear, strong role for the health board and the local authority. And the objective of the exercise is to maximise their mutual support, I suppose, for one another in terms of delivering services for a common population of need. Don't see it as a separate exercise. Also, as the bill stands, but I would invite my colleague Frances to come in at this point if she wished to, the duties that are placed upon that joint board are duties relating to strategic planning. What it is conceived as is this central point at which the health and local authority interests must come together to plan together for the population of need, for maximum effect for the population, and also to maximise potential efficiency and effectiveness for the organisations themselves. Do you wish to?
In terms of the technical aspects of the bill, there's a strong role for the health board and the local authority around strategic planning. The duties are on the body corporate as described in the bill. However, there's a clear duty on that body corporate to fully consult on the health board and local authority to ensure that they are full partners in that strategic planning process.
Probably beyond the remit of this committee, but I mean, I would merely add that both NHS Lothian and the City of Edinburgh Council think there is a big gap between the policy memorandum and what the bill actually says, which is something that needs to be ironed out in the committee.
Thank you, Malcolm. Michael, to be followed by John.
Thank you, you've already had a heads up on the area that I'm concerned about, and it's not dissimilar to Malcolm's, and I suppose we get into this dancing on the head of a pin about whether a new integration joint board or an integration joint monitoring committee is a different institution from what already exists. But the fact is they're referred to in the financial memorandum as separate entities, and you've also got to take into account education and training when it comes to the organisational redevelopment. So when it says in the financial memorandum that support will be necessary, I'm assuming that's not flags and banners and cheerleaders. We're talking about financial support. And there's a cost involved in that. Now, we heard from Mr Kenton that Highland didn't really have a take on that because they're not going to work under this system. But there have been concerns raised that the cost implications of this transformation are not adequately addressed in the financial memorandum. So do you want to comment on that?
Estimates for organisational development, including the financial memo, were based on estimates by, goodness, I've forgotten the name, Triple
the
SC.
Scottish Social Services Council and NHS Education Services.
Yeah, to provide organisational development for the members of the integration joint boards. In addition to that, we're looking to develop the strategic planning capabilities and develop those within partnerships as well, and they're included within that estimate from Triple SC. So,
in the response I had earlier, there was some comment on management positions being lost and redundancy costs being incurred around that. Have they been included in the financial memorandum?
yes, I don't have the reference point, but we included a provision for potential displacement cost of CHP general managers, but only CHP general managers. We haven't included any other posts, as the CHP general managers will be directly removed from, the post will be removed as a result of the bill.
So it's been taken, have numbers been discussed in relation to this? And can these numbers be achieved by voluntary redundancy?
Yeah, for the CHP general managers, I think we set out 3 scenarios. One is that all of the general managers are successful in applying for the chief officer posts within the joint boards. Another scenario is that none are successful, and then a midway point where half are successful. And for each of those scenarios, we then calculate what the potential displacement costs might be, depending on the numbers that are not successful. And for each of those, we assumed half would be made redundant and half would go on a redeployment register and then subsequently be employed. I'm just trying to, for my notes.
And just also, obviously we're in a very fortunate position in having had a pilot that we can take cognizance of when we've been developing the costs, but we're also aware that Highland were in a slightly different position, partly through the speed in which they implemented. The other partnerships, recognising they're all at different stages, but some are already implementing what they're calling shadow arrangements, and some already have appointed to some of these posts. So there are different partnerships that we can take to give us a bit more assurance about costs or not. But certainly some of the partnerships have been able to set up their shadow arrangements without additional costs being incurred. So it is very much, I think, going to be different in each partnership. Some may have costs because of their particular circumstances and the particular structures that they have. Others, we believe, the cost may be very, very insignificant. So I think there is a bit of a spectrum there. But the fact that the partnerships do have more time to put the arrangements in place, I think we would hope would allow them both to resolve some of the potential issues they might have, but also to work through any potential for redeployment that there might be.
Just on page 31, paragraph 51, financial memo, we have if none of the 28 displaced CHP general managers are successful, the cost would be 3.5 million in 14-15 and then 1.3 million in the 2 years subsequent to that. If half are successful, it would be proportionately low. It would be 1.8 in 14-15 and then 0.7 for the 2 years after that.
John, to be followed by Gavin.
Yes, I mean, to some extent, I think continuing on the same theme, the point was made, I think it was in a Highland NHS submission that, which the convener quoted earlier. It's worth noting integration of budgets between partner bodies requires a high degree of trust and openness, and this is much about leadership and culture as legislation. And we've had the example in Glasgow where basically that didn't work. So are you is your feeling now that the legislation is sufficient, even if people don't go on with each other, or is it actually dependent on attitudes?
I'll take that one. I don't think any of us would make the leap that legislation alone is sufficient. But I think our position, Minister's position, is that given the shape of population need, it is reasonable in light of experience of last several years of partnership working at this stage to place a particular emphasis on the importance of effective integrated working. And I think what legislation can do in this instance is place the importance of working effectively together on a different footing. It can put us in a position where, in terms of public sector leadership, I suppose, it becomes something that is defined in statute as necessary. And that places it in a different context. But no, alone it's not enough. And the Financial Memorandum does reflect upon issues like organisational development and leadership development, which are key to tackling the challenges ahead, on which we're not starting from a clean sheet, but about which there is a renewed emphasis as we reflect on developing need. So it's a mixed picture.
I mean, we seem to have a very good example in Highland, and it seems to have worked well from what I can see at a distance. But, my concern is that if we're repeating this 32 times, we may have one or two, and I suppose our job as a committee is to be a bit sceptical and see if there's cost implications, because it seems to me that if the new joint board, or whatever it's called, kind of develops a life of its own, and it's effectively, we've then got three legal entities all trying to relate to each other, there are cost implications in that.
The joint board has to have some life of its own because it is meant to lead strategic planning in an integrated way which is set out in a manner that's fairly novel. But it does need to be carefully and closely bound into a relationship with the health board and the local authority, which are the points that Francis was reflecting upon. You raise the issue of, we have seen success in Highland, indeed, and there are other examples of areas that are well down the path of an integrated approach, although, for the reasons Mr Kenton raised, nobody is actually doing the joint board arrangement as it's described in the bill at this stage. But we can learn from places like Edinburgh City Council and West Lothian and West Dunbartonshire and all other places which have an integrated approach in place, where there are challenges, and I think we all know that in any programme of change, particularly something as significant as this, there will be areas where there are specific challenge. We will need to look to provide support and improvement support. And we have established arrangements in place to help with local development as necessary as this rolls out. I'm not sure whether my colleagues who have worked directly on the financial memorandum detail would want to add anything to that. No.
I mean, I'm wondering, the question I asked East Dunbartonshire before was, you know, if they hand over £10 million to the joint body, is it going to have to be kind of double accounted for, so that the joint body has to scrutinise exactly where that 10 million is used for, and East Dunbartonshire will also be scrutinising exactly where it goes? And are they, if they don't do that, will their auditors be in there criticising them? But I mean, again, I just fear there's a bit of duplication going in there.
Your concern, I think it has to be of key importance to us that in the pursuit of improving outcomes, we don't create a whole new bureaucracy and a whole new science. But I'm going to hand over to Christine, I think, to reflect on how we're handling it.
That's very much the focus of the resources group, is looking at the accounting impact of this, and very much with a focus on doing it once and being able to take an approach that we use. I think you can look at many areas of services where there are hosted arrangements in place, and Glasgow's a good example of that, where there's often one part of a system or one council that takes a lead on a service and provides it to others. So there's some pretty tried and tested ways of ensuring that a service can be provided somewhere, and that it doesn't need to result in duplication of effort, whether it's in accounting terms or whether it's in bureaucracy or administration of people involved in it. So that's very much our approach here, is to have transparency through the accounting, and to avoid having to have any kind of multiple accounting route or additional bureaucracy. You know, we're not at this point in time anticipating increases in staff, because there already are staff who work on this area of resources, both within CHPs and within local authorities, so that there's nothing that suggests right now that there is a need to overlay anything on top of that. We're looking at how we can use existing resources, existing infrastructures, in as far as possible.
And the specific problem that Highland seemed to come up with properties moving between the two sides, is that something you're anticipating, or how would that be dealt with?
Something that we're very aware of. It relates to the lead agency model, and there is a way of dealing with that where assets would be retained under local authority provision. So that there are, I think I'd probably be fairly confident to say that up until now, everything that we've identified as a potential issue to be resolved, we have either resolved or have a couple of different options and ways in which partnerships can resolve. So these are all probably in the category of technical issues, because we are working within existing structures within local authorities and health boards. But there's pretty much a way through all of these. And obviously we'll try to make sure that any solutions are done without additional financial implications.
So would VAT be one which has been resolved, or there's a few options? Well,
we're close to resolution on VAT. We've been working very effectively with HMRC on that, really good engagement with them. But we're not yet at the point of having a formal decision, but certainly the model that we've put forward, the advice that we're getting back from HMRC is that on the face of it, it looks like certainly that they are in agreement with our working assumptions through that, which would mean that there wouldn't be any additional VAT burden. We're very clear that we weren't looking to do something that is creating any additional opportunity on VAT. What we're looking to do is to create a VAT neutral position on VAT. So all of our risk mitigation is about making sure that we deal with it early, and that we have good engagement, because we from the very outset we've been relatively confident that there was a way that we could work this, that we wouldn't increase any VAT costs to local authorities.
Okay, thanks so much.
Thank you. Gavin, to be followed by Jean.
Thank you. I want to go through quite a few parts of the financial memorandum, if I can. Just before I do that, though, I just wanted to clarify, did I hear from Paul Leake right? Mr. Leake, did you say that there was no time to consult on the financial memorandum?
They've used the wrong terminology, okay. Francis.
We We did consult with ADSW and with COSLA, and we also consulted with our third sector and independent sector colleagues on some of the assumptions and estimates that we have identified and are in the financial memorandum. I suppose Paul's terminology was referring to a formal consultation that might include a wider distribution and a wider stakeholder group.
Okay, so just you spoke to some stakeholders, but there wasn't a formal consultation.
Absolutely, yes.
Okay, just why was there not time to have a formal consultation?
It was felt that the best approach was to use existing examples around the country, as my colleagues have already said. So using Highland as an example, speaking to colleagues who are already well progressed in integrating services, so West Lothian and East Dunbartonshire, and then speaking to specific professional groups and stakeholders that had key areas of impact, like the third sector, who are obviously big providers of care services, would be the most efficient use of our time in terms of identifying the estimates that are in the financial memorandum.
Forgive me for labour point though. What was it? Did you choose to do that because you thought it was a better way of doing it, or was it because of pressure of time?
We felt it was the most appropriate engagement method, and in fact we have had feedback from colleagues and stakeholders that they were very receptive to our approach.
Thank you. Thanks for clearing that up. In terms of efficiency, I mean, obviously the convener raised efficiencies, and Malcolm Chisholm raised the point specifically around reducing variations. I just wonder if we can go through the three categories of efficiencies in a bit more detail. I feel the financial memorandum is a bit light. It has a bit of blurb, if you like, and then produces a figure. And I have to say, as a member of the Finance Committee, it's quite difficult to know where that figure has come from and whether it's right. You say 104 million, for example, for reducing variation. You could have said 204, and I wouldn't have known from what I've got in the memorandum whether it's 104 or 204. If we take delayed discharges first, just because you cover that first in the memorandum, the savings are estimated to be between £22 million and £41 million per annum. It's page 25, I think, of the document. What would need, if we take the 22 million first, what would need to happen in order to save 22 million pounds a year? My reading of it, my health background is poor, I have to say, but my reading of it is that would be the saving if there was nobody at all staying in hospital for more than 14 days.
Yes. To arrive at that calculation, we looked at the total days that are spent post people being ready to clinically ready to go home, and counted 14 days from that, and then basically had a number of days after that, and that was equivalent to the total delayed discharge, something like 80 wards, I think, across Scotland. So it's a material level of resource. So the assumption was that all of the days post 14 days, if there was sufficient community capacity, both in community health district nursing and in social care, to prevent those delays, then those patients could go home. However, the resource that would be released from that would need to be recycled into the provision of that community capacity. So we calculated the total resource used for those post 14-day delays, took away from that any fixed costs and semi-fixed costs. It was just the direct costs in relation to that, which should be able to be released. And then offset from that, what we estimated would be needed to be provided within the community, both in social care and health care, and the net figure was the figure for £22 million.
How likely is it, though, that we get to a stage where nobody is delayed for more than 14 days? I mean, is that a realistic goal, or is that sort of best case scenario?
Well, I think we need to recognise that we're in a dynamic situation, as we've discussed. We've got increasing demand due to demographic change. So any efficiencies we make might potentially just be creating capacity to cope with the increased demand in the future. But nonetheless, we need to make them. And particularly in relation to delayed discharges, which have the evidence is that elderly people start to experience functional decline after 3 days. So there's an imperative really to get people home into or a homely setting as soon as possible. So We think that, given the scale of this, it's not marginal, it's a material level of resource, and given the clinical imperative and care imperative, that partners should, through strategic planning, be able to reorganise the resources and create capacity that's needed in the community. Prioritise the resources, if you like, to create that capacity. The question which we don't know is, it may be that all that does is create capacity for increased demand in the future.
But just to come back to the question though, is getting to a situation where obviously it's desirable and that everybody wants it, how likely is it that it happens, and how long do we think it takes to...
We have, there's some, well, the evidence from Torbay, for instance, with the integrated system, and North East Lincolnshire and Isle of Wight all have an integrated system, is that they don't have delayed discharges. So the evidence is that it's possible through redirection of resources.
Second category then, anticipatory care plans. I think there's a 12 million projected saving for that, based on a Nairn study. So my question there is, how robust is that study, and how likely is what happened in Nairn really to be replicated elsewhere?
It's a robust study. It was published in the British Journal of General Practice, so it's a second tier level study, peer reviewed. The evidence from Nairn is transferable to other partnerships in Scotland, but it's contingent on an integrated approach. Nairn fostered an integrated approach between health and social care, locality teams, integrated teams working closely together, and a reactive response to people who are admitted. So there's no question that it's transferable. And we've since had a subsequent study across other settings, which indicates that the potential savings are £16 million. So it supports our initial assessment.
Okay. And the third category, again, I suppose the largest one, reducing variations. I mean, Malcolm Chisholm has asked about that already. But in relation to that, getting to the 104 million, is that a situation where there is effectively no variation at all inside health? Where would we have to get to realise that level of saving?
What we assumed there was that if we take a 4 partnership health board, we assumed that those partnerships that were above the average were able to over time get down to the average. There would still be variation within the partnership, so it's not removing all variation.
Because you outline in your financial memorandum the differences could be due to differences in local democratic decisions, input costs, prevalence of unpaid care, the relative size of the voluntary sector, or inefficiencies. You're not relying on almost all of it being down to inefficiencies.
That particular sentence relates to the variation in social care expenditure, and because of those reasons, we removed that from the analysis and we just focused on health board, the variation in health board expenditure, and through that process we controlled for the demographic profile of the population and differences in needs. We controlled for demand side issues, which leaves that the only explanation for variation is supply side decisions, historical supply side decisions.
Just lastly on that one, is there a way of getting to us some workings on this? Because as I said in my opening remarks, 104 is plucked out. It may well be absolutely right, but I've got no way of knowing.
I'll prepare an explanation of the statement.
Last issue, if I may convener, just in terms of the savings, which hasn't been touched on yet. VAT. Now you cover this in the financial memorandum. I think your view ultimately, at least on the 28th of May when you lodged it, was that it was likely to be VAT neutral. We've had some submissions, for example, South Lanarkshire Council said VAT's critical. Obviously, if it's 32 million, it is critical. It requires to be confirmed in order to inform their formation. ADSW raised some concerns about it, asking if the Scottish Government are going to fund the pressures should they occur. Has anything happened since the 28th of May, and are you in a position to confirm that it will be VAT neutral?
Yeah, I think my earlier answer probably still stands, that we are still in very constructive dialogue with HMRC, but we don't have a formal position from them on it. But certainly the information that we've provided, the verbal response from HMRC is that they are in agreement with our logic that gets to a VAT neutral position. But I wouldn't like to commit them at this point in time, because there's still some further work to be done on that. But certainly it's very encouraging at this point in time.
You know, I'm not going to ask you to overreach, but I mean, just for absolute clarity, the verbal position of HMRC as it stands is that it will definitely be cost neutral.
No, sorry, that isn't what I said. But Paul was at the last meeting with HMRC, so I'll ask him to confirm.
The VAT issue is different for the different models. So the HMRC have advised us that, in their opinion, the integration joint board, the body corporate model, the integration joint board is not a taxable person because it's not providing services. However, there's a provision in the bill at some point in the future that it may be empowered to do so, and their view is that in that case it would become a taxable person, and the question of Section 33 or 41 status would need to be decided on. As regards lead agency, it's a slightly more settled matter in that there is existing guidance which relates to England, Department of Health and HMRC, and we've been developing with HMRC a Scottish version of that, and in fact Highland have just recently had a decision on the basis of that model which has allowed them to achieve a VAT neutral position. So we'll be building on that to produce a Scottish-wide guidance.
So your position from the memorandum stands, it's likely that it will be cost neutral. Is that a fair description?
Yes.
That's certainly our working assumption, if I could put it like that. Our working assumption is that it will be VAT neutral, and there's nothing so far from our discussions with HMRC that would change our position on that.
Thanks. Jean.
Thank you. I mean, a lot of points have been answered in the earlier questions, but just a couple of things. Nick Kenton mentioned in the experience of Highland the 400-page agreement, and on reflection, I think he was saying that actually was probably too detailed, and that given, I guess, the culture of the Scottish Government looking at outcomes and single outcome agreements and so on with agencies such as health boards, is that a bit of a mismatch there? And is that something that you see that can be simplified in a very complex situation? That was one point. And the other really was just about the language of the joint boards. I mean, I think to everybody it does slightly conjure up this another tier of governance, whereas I mean, I was associated a wee bit in the early days of the Highland experience, as it were, and I think that wasn't. It kind of wasn't an issue, partly because there was already joint working in other areas, but I don't remember it being, and yet it seems to be an option, and I would have thought that we'd be very anxious for that not to happen.
Questions, if that's fine, Convener. Thank you. We've had the opportunity, as we've developed this policy and this piece of legislation, fortunately, to reflect upon evidence from elsewhere. My colleagues have mentioned one or two places in other parts of the UK which can demonstrate significantly better outcomes on the basis of what you can describe in informal terms as better integrated working. And we've been able to learn from these places. The key lessons that we have taken from all of the evidence that we've been able to review, both written and talking to people and visiting people, is that there aren't fixed structural models which will deliver better integration just by virtue of being, imposed upon a system as it currently exists. And none of us would expect that. I think common sense and experience tell us that. But there are characteristics of successful systems that we can pick up on. And this is what we've tried to do in both the policy and in the bill. And the four key characteristics that we always return to when we're talking to people about this are that where you get much better outcomes from integrated systems, people plan together for their populations of need, they bring their resources together, they bring clinical leadership right into the forefront of what they're doing, and they exhibit very strong general leadership. Now, in respect to the detail that needs to be covered in what we might describe as a partnership agreement between the health board and the local authority, one of the important lessons that we learned from other places was The partnership agreement needs to be as detailed as it needs to be for local circumstance, but it does need to be given thorough consideration because, as Mr Kenton has reflected, it is very hard to in any way anticipate every eventuality that might arise, but at the same time we don't want to end up with a massive new bureaucracy. So what we're doing in that respect is investing effort now in starting to look at the sort of guidance that will be particularly beneficial to local partnerships to make sure that they capture in that partnership agreement sufficient information to let them deal with the challenges that are coming and to nail down the parameters of their partnership arrangement, but without overwhelming them. And as Christine has reflected about financial matters, the fact that we have a living example in Scotland in Highland is tremendously helpful. So we have quite a lot of work underway and we recognise the risks around some of that. But we have to offset those against, I think, the risk of failing to act, if you like. The language of the joint board, yes, I think we all recognise that there is a tension there, or a potential tension there. The reason I reflected upon the evidence that we've learned about from elsewhere is that this idea of planning for your population of need and bringing your resources together, not just money, although money obviously is tremendously important, but the human resources that support service delivery and all of this stuff, that seems to be what helps to shift the outcomes. And where people don't want to use the lead agency model, and there are good reasons in some areas why people don't want to do that, we needed to provide an alternative. And by describing this joint board, what we've attempted to do is describe an arrangement that is knitted in to the health board and the local authority, but at the same time does provide the focus for that population-based planning and bringing together the two sets of resources to deliver.
Okay, thank you very much, and that has exhausted the questions from the committee. I just want to ask a couple more myself just to wind up. First of all, I'm just wondering what the target is, if any, with regard to delayed discharges in the National Performance Framework.
Ministers have established a new target for delayed discharge this year. Local partnerships are working towards delays of no more than 28 days, am I correct?
Just getting this.
Thank you. Moving to a 14-day target. If Paul can check the timescale, that would be helpful. But there is quite a considerable investment of effort in trying to shift the pattern of delayed discharge. I think in part because there is some anecdotal evidence which would apply to any such situation, that where one has a target, it becomes easy for people to focus on that, and there is opportunity for improvement in this respect. Would it be best if we wrote to the committee on this particular point?
Yes, because I mean, for example, we asked, or I asked Dunbartonshire about their submission, because they obviously thought that the 14-day target, they were concerned about how realistic it was for some of them to be able to, local authorities to be able to do that, working with health boards.
I think ministers have reflected quite carefully on the evidence for the improvement in delayed discharge over recent years in Scotland, which has seen a tremendous degree of progress.
And I've got a very
yes, exactly. It is a dramatic graph. And I think the evidence from elsewhere does suggest that there remains opportunity for improvement. So we shall write to the committee with details of timescales for the new targets.
Thank you.
Okay?
Just one other point, actually. I mean, obviously, the point of the bill is improved efficiency, better outcomes, and a lower cost to the taxpayer. But is it not a wee bit of a kind of halfway house? You know, should we not? Is it not time to cut the Gordian knot? And I'm not asking for a political answer on this, but if you look at Ayrshire, for example, we've got 3 local authorities and we've got a health board. Already, the local authorities are working closely with the health board. They also share things like, you know, payroll, council tax collection among themselves, and are coming closer. Would it not be actually more responsive in terms of the needs of people if you had one organisation which fully merged local authorities with health boards to provide more strategic overview, reduce costs, while at the same time perhaps resurrecting some of the local town councils which could provide locally responsive services which people still talk about some 40 years after they were abolished. So I'm just wondering if you could maybe comment on that.
I think
from an efficiency, a better outcome and lower cost perspective, not a necessarily political one.
while I think any question around public sector reform more broadly is one that we would refer to ministers.
But somehow I thought that would be
Yeah.
nice. I thought I would take a chance anyway. Nevertheless, I'd like to thank everyone. That certainly woke Jamie up. I'd like to thank everyone on the committee for their questions, and I'd like to thank our witnesses for their answers. That being all we have today before us, that is the end of today's committee. Thank you very much.